The boardroom stretched wide and sterile, all glass and polished mahogany. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like wasps trapped in a jar. Marcus Webb adjusted his royal blue tie and checked his Rolex, 8:57 a.m. The CEO was late again. He scanned the room with the ease of someone who'd occupied this space for 12 years. Familiar faces nodded back. Then his eyes stopped. A black woman sat in one of the side chairs near the door. Mid-40s emerald green blazer, leather portfolio across her lap. Marcus had never seen her before. "Excuse me," he called across the room. His voice carried that particular tone, friendly on the surface, dismissive underneath. "We're about to start. Could you grab a notepad from the supply closet?" The woman looked up. Her expression remained perfectly neutral. "The small conference room," Marcus continued, gesturing vaguely. "Yellow legal pads. We'll need someone taking minutes today." He turned back to his phone, already forgetting her. Several executives shifted in their seats. Sarah Chen, the VP of Operations, opened her mouth, then closed it. Marcus's assistant, Jennifer, went pale. "Jennifer," Marcus said without looking up, "show her where we keep the supplies. And bring me a coffee. 2 sugars." The woman in the emerald blazer stood slowly. She smoothed her jacket with deliberate care. "Of course," she said quietly. Her voice was warm molasses over steel. "I'll take excellent notes." Something in her tone made Sarah Chen look away. But Marcus just smiled, already discussing quarterly projections with the executive beside him. The woman walked toward the small table at the room's corner, her heels clicking softly against marble floors. She sat down, pulled out a pen, and opened her portfolio. Her hands were steady. Her face betrayed nothing. But if anyone had been watching closely, if anyone had bothered to really look, they would have seen her eyes. They promised something Marcus wouldn't understand until it was far too late. 6 hours earlier, Diane Mitchell had stood in her kitchen, watching sunrise paint her countertops gold. Coffee steamed beside her laptop. NPR murmured about market fluctuations and policy changes. She'd been awake since 4:30. Old habit. 20 years in corporate finance taught you to claim the quiet hours before the world made demands. Her daughter's college acceptance letter was still magnetized to the fridge. Howard University. Full scholarship. Diane touched it every morning like a talisman. Everything she'd built, every 16-hour day, every conference room where she was the only black face, it led here. To Kendra, having choices Diane never had. The email had arrived at 11:47 p.m. 3 days ago. Subject line, board appointment, confidential. Diane had read it 17 times. Each reading felt like touching a bruise to confirm it was real. Board chair. Youngest person appointed in the company's 40-year history. First woman. First black executive in any C-suite role. Robert Chen, no relation to Sarah, had called immediately after. Her mentor for 15 years, the man who'd pulled her from financial analyst to VP of strategic development. "They'll test you," he'd said. "Especially Webb. He's been positioning himself for this role for 3 years. "I know Marcus's type," Diane had replied. "Do you?" Robert's voice went quiet. "He's not just ambitious, Diane, he's vicious, particularly toward women, especially women of color. 3 harassment complaints buried in HR. 2 minority executives who left, rather than work under him." Diane had watched her daughter's acceptance letter flutter in the breeze from the open window. Then it's good I'm not working under him. Now, standing in that boardroom corner, Diane thought about her grandmother. Betty Mitchell had cleaned office buildings in downtown Chicago for 30 years. She'd scrubbed these same floors, probably. Emptied these same trash cans. Grandma Betty used to say, "Baby, powerful people think invisible people don't have eyes. They never see us watching, learning, remembering." Diane clicked her pen open. She'd take notes. Just not the kind Marcus expected. Marcus leaned back in his chair, projecting ease he'd perfected over years. "Before the CEO arrives, let's address the elephant in the room." Budget cuts. Nervous laughter rippled through executives. Everyone knew what budget cuts meant. Someone's department was about to bleed. "I've been reviewing operational redundancies," Marcus continued. His eyes gleamed. "We're carrying dead weight. Time for house cleaning." He pulled up a presentation on the screen. Pie charts, efficiency metrics, color-coded departments marked for restructuring. Sarah Chen's operations division was highlighted in burnt orange, warning color. "Operations is overstaffed by 37%, Marcus declared. "I'm proposing we trim middle management and consolidate under a new reporting structure." "My reporting structure?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "Those positions are already lean. We'd lose institutional knowledge and—" "What we'd lose," Marcus interrupted, "is unnecessary expense. The board will approve this today. Trust me." He smiled at the other executives. "Change is coming, folks. Better get comfortable." Jennifer, his assistant, leaned forward from her corner position. "Mr. Webb," she whispered urgently, "I need to tell you something about—" Marcus waved her off without looking. "Not now, Jennifer. Can't you see we're in the middle of something important?" Jennifer sat back, her face flushing. She glanced at Diane in the corner. Diane met her eyes briefly, then returned to her notepad. "Now," Marcus continued, warming to his performance, "let's talk about the new diversity initiative corporate keeps pushing. Frankly, I think we're wasting resources chasing quotas instead of qualifications." He chuckled. "But that's above my pay grade. For now." The last two words hung in the air like a threat or a promise. Several executives studied their papers intensely. David Park, the CTO, cleared his throat but said nothing. Marcus's power in this room was obvious. Challenger him meant risking your career. Marcus checked his Rolex again. "Where the hell is Anderson?" "CEO or not, meetings start on time." He turned to Diane without really seeing her. "You getting all this? Make sure to note that operations needs immediate restructuring." "Use those exact words." Diane's pen moved steadily across paper. "Every word," she said softly. Marcus grinned at the executive beside him. "See? Maybe we should keep this one." "Finally found someone who listens." Light laughter, uncomfortable but present. Sarah Chen stared at her hands. In the corner, Diane underlined a phrase in her notes. "Operational redundancies, cross-reference with vendor contracts, expense reports." Her financial analyst brain was already working, connecting dots Marcus didn't know he'd revealed. The boardroom door opened. Finally, Diane's pen stayed steady, but inside, a familiar rage simmered. Not hot, not explosive. Cold, calculated. The kind of anger that had fueled her through 2 decades of moments like this. "You getting all this?" She'd heard variations her entire career. The assumption in his voice, the casual certainty that she existed to serve him, was a language she'd been fluent in since her first internship. 22 years old, Harvard MBA fresh in hand, and the senior partner had asked her to fetch his dry cleaning. She'd fetched it. Then she'd restructured his entire portfolio and saved the firm $2 million. That was the game. Play smaller than you are until the moment you don't. But today stung differently. This was supposed to be her coronation. 3 weeks of preparation, reviewing every department's reports, memorizing every executive's record. She'd envisioned walking in as board chair, commanding respect from first handshake. Instead, Marcus Webb saw her skin and made assumptions that would have been laughable if they weren't so predictable. Diane thought about Kendra, asleep in her dorm room right now. Her daughter, who'd never worked twice as hard for half the credit, who'd never smiled through disrespect or pretended not to notice when she was the only black face in the conference photo. That was the dream, wasn't it? Each generation fighting so the next one didn't have to. Grandma Betty's voice echoed again. "Baby, anger is a tool. You can swing it like a hammer, or you can sharpen it like a scalpel. One makes noise, one cuts clean." Diane looked at the notepad before her. Marcus's budget proposal, his casual mention of house cleaning. The way he dismissed his own assistant, Jennifer, who clearly knew something he didn't. She clicked her pen closed, then open again. Steady rhythm, meditative. The door opening had changed the room's energy. Diane felt the shift like barometric pressure before a storm. She looked up. Robert Anderson, the CEO, entered looking harried and apologetic, and behind him, Diane's breath caught, walked Robert Chen, her mentor, carrying a folder she recognized immediately, her official appointment documents. Marcus still hadn't noticed. He was already standing, ready to begin his performance. Diane's anger crystallized into something harder, sharper. She was about to perform surgery. 3 days ago, Diane had sat in Robert Chen's office overlooking Lake Michigan. Late afternoon light turned the water into hammered bronze. He'd poured them both scotch despite the early hour. The board vote was unanimous, Robert said. 11-0. You're the youngest board chair in company history. Diane had expected elation. Instead, she felt the weight of 40 years pressing down. Tell me about Marcus Webb. Robert swirled his scotch. Smart. Ruthless, climbed from junior analyst to CFO in 10 years. Impressive except for how he climbed. He pulled out a file. 3 sexual harassment complaints. Settled quietly. 2 involve women of color who no longer work here. Why is he still employed? Because he's good at his job. The legitimate parts, anyway. He's made the company profitable. Board members overlook character flaws when quarterly earnings look right. Robert leaned forward. But I've been watching him. So has Anderson. We think he's running side deals. Nothing proven yet. Diane opened the file. Names she recognized. Women who'd left suddenly. Exit interviews marked confidential. What do you need from me? Time. 3 weeks of quiet consulting before your official announcement. Review his department with fresh eyes. Find what we've missed. Robert smiled slightly. Think of it as your final exam. She'd spent those 3 weeks living in financial reports. Marcus's vendor contracts showed patterns. Same suppliers, rotating company names, all registered to addresses that didn't quite exist. Expense reports for conferences that had no record of his attendance. Small discrepancies. Death by 1,000 cuts, but nothing conclusive enough to move without absolute certainty. He'll test you immediately, Robert had warned. Men like Marcus need to establish dominance, especially with women, especially with you. Let him, Diane had said. Now watching Marcus preen at the boardroom head, she understood. He wasn't just arrogant. He was predictable. And predictability was a weakness. Her grandmother had cleaned buildings, but she'd taught Diane something crucial. Powerful people perform their power constantly. They needed audiences, witnesses, confirmation of their superiority. They're so busy making sure you know they're important, Grandma Betty used to say. They don't notice you learning their secrets. The trash tells stories, baby. So do expense reports left on desks. Diane's notepad filled with Marcus's words. His casual mention of restructuring Sarah Chen's department, the only other woman executive. His joke about diversity initiatives. His dismissal of Jennifer's warning. Every word was a confession. He just didn't know it yet. Robert Chen caught her eye from across the room. His expression asked a question. Ready? Diane nodded once. Scalpel sharpened. While Marcus pontificated about operational efficiency, Diane's eyes tracked the documents spread before him. She had perfect sight lines from her corner position, another assumption Marcus made, thinking she wouldn't understand the numbers glowing on his laptop screen. But Diane had spent 20 years reading financial documents upside down, sideways, in dim conference rooms and bright airport lounges. Pattern recognition was her superpower. The vendor contracts Marcus had mentioned earlier, she'd reviewed them during her 3-week deep dive. Atlas Solutions, Summit Consulting, Vertex Strategies, different names, same ownership structure, all contracts signed by Marcus personally, all billing rates 30% above market average. Now watching him gesture at his restructuring proposal, she noticed something new. The operations department cuts he proposed would eliminate the compliance officer position. The one person who audited vendor contracts, not a coincidence. Never a coincidence. Her heart rate increased, but her hands stayed steady. She made a note. Compliance elimination Fortbroer removes oversight of vendor contracts. Cross-reference with expense reports Q2, Q4. Marcus was still talking, oblivious. We'll streamline reporting structures. Reduce redundant oversight. Trust the people we've empowered to do their jobs without excessive bureaucracy. Translation: eliminate anyone who might notice what he was doing. Diane thought about Jennifer's attempted warning. Marcus's assistant had tried to speak twice now. What did she know? Jennifer's position gave her access to everything. Calendars, emails, expense submissions. She was the invisible woman who saw everything, just like Grandma Betty had been. The door finally opened wider. CEO Anderson entered, followed by Robert Chen. Both men carried folders. Diane felt the room's energy shift. Sarah Chen sat straighter. David Park looked relieved. Even Marcus's closest allies seemed to sense something changing. Marcus turned, smile ready. Anderson, finally. He stopped. His eyes landed on Robert Chen, then on the folders. Corporate letterhead visible. Official seals. For the first time that morning, uncertainty flickered across Marcus's face. Sorry I'm late, Anderson said. His voice carried an edge Diane recognized. The tone of a CEO who'd made a decision and wouldn't be questioned. We have some announcements before we begin regular business. Marcus glanced at Diane in the corner, then back at Anderson. Announcements? Anderson moved to the head of the table, Marcus's position. Marcus stepped aside, but his jaw tightened. I'd like to introduce our new board chair, officially starting today. The room held its breath. Marcus's smile returned, confident again. He probably expected some ally, someone he'd already cultivated. Anderson gestured toward the corner. Everyone, please welcome Diane Mitchell. Marcus's smile froze like a crack spreading across ice. His eyes darted to the woman in the corner, the woman he'd dismissed as administrative staff 30 minutes ago. The woman he'd ordered to take notes. I'm sorry, what? Marcus's voice came out strangled. Diane stood slowly. She gathered her portfolio with deliberate precision, each movement controlled. The emerald green blazer caught the fluorescent light as she walked toward the head of the table. Her heels echoed in the sudden silence. Every executive watched her cross the room. Sarah Chen's expression shifted from confusion to something like vindication. David Park's mouth hung slightly open. Jennifer, Marcus's assistant, pressed her hand over her mouth, whether hiding a smile or shock. It was impossible to tell. Ms. Mitchell was appointed board chair by unanimous vote 3 days ago. Anderson continued, his voice gaining strength. She's been consulting with leadership during the transition period. I should have introduced her immediately, but traffic delayed us. Marcus stepped back from the table head, but his feet seemed glued to expensive carpet. His face had gone from confident tan to unhealthy pallor. This is... I wasn't informed. It was confidential until this morning, Robert Chen said smoothly. He placed a folder in front of Diane's new position, at the table's head. The official announcement goes out at 9:30. Diane reached the head of the table. She didn't sit immediately. Instead, she stood behind the leather chair, the power position Marcus had occupied minutes before, and let the silence build. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, measured. Good morning, everyone. She met each executive's eyes in turn. I'm looking forward to working with this team. I've spent the past 3 weeks reviewing departmental reports and operational structures. Her gaze landed on Marcus. Very thorough reviews. Marcus's throat bobbed. He attempted recovery, forcing his salesman's smile back into place. Well, this is certainly unexpected. Welcome aboard, Ms. Mitchell. He gestured to the presentation still glowing on the screen. I was just outlining some efficiency proposals. Perhaps you'd like to review them before... I've reviewed them, Diane said. She opened her portfolio, the one Marcus thought contained secretary's notes, and pulled out documents. In fact, I have several questions about your operational recommendations and about other matters. She placed a single sheet of paper on the table. Marcus couldn't see it from his position, but his eyes tracked it like a snake watching a mongoose. But first, Diane continued, let's address meeting protocol. Everyone, please take your assigned seats. We have considerable business to discuss. Marcus stood frozen. His assigned seat was no longer at the head. It was 3 positions down beside Sarah Chen. The demotion was subtle but absolute. He looked at Anderson, searching for an ally. The CEO's expression gave nothing. Mr. Webb, Diane said softly. Your seat. Marcus moved to his new position like a man walking toward execution. His expensive suit suddenly looked too tight. Sweat beaded at his temples despite the air conditioning. Diane sat down at the head of the table. The leather chair seemed made for her. She arranged her documents with precise care, then looked up at the assembled executives. Let's begin with transparency, she said. This company has struggled with accountability in recent years. That changes today. She picked up the paper she'd placed down earlier. Marcus's eyes locked onto it. His hands gripped the table edge. Mr. Webb, your restructuring proposal suggests eliminating the compliance officer position in operations. Can you explain the reasoning? Marcus cleared his throat once, twice. Redundancy. We have legal review and internal audit. Compliance is duplicative oversight that slows. The compliance officer is the only position that audits vendor contracts, Diane interrupted. Her voice stayed level. Eliminating that role would remove oversight of procurement processes, so including contracts you personally approve. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus tried to laugh. It came out wrong. I'm not sure what you're implying, but my vendor relationships are all above board. Everything goes through proper channels. Does it? Diane pulled out another document. Atlas Solutions. Summit Consulting. Vertex Strategies. 3 vendors you've contracted with extensively over the past 18 months. Combined billings of $2.3 million. She looked up. Her eyes were surgical. All 3 companies share the same registered agent, the same business address, a UPS store in Naperville. And all 3 list your brother-in-law David Webb as primary officer. The room erupted in whispers. Sarah Chen leaned forward. Robert Chen's expression remained carefully neutral, but his eyes gleamed. Marcus's face went from pale to red. Those are legitimate consulting services. My brother-in-law runs a respected firm. There's no conflict of interest. I disclosed the relationship. You disclosed 1 company, Diane said, not 3 operating under different names. And you didn't disclose that these consulting services include expense reports for conferences that don't exist. She pulled out another sheet. The National Finance Summit in Miami, March 15th. You billed the company $8,400 for attendance. That summit was cancelled 8 months prior. The venue confirms no events that week. Marcus stood abruptly. His chair scraped against marble. This is ambush. You've been investigating me? You can't just walk in here and... I can, actually. Diane's voice cut through his bluster like a blade through silk. That's what board chair means, Mr. Webb. Oversight, accountability, transparency. She paused. Things you've operated without for far too long. Anderson leaned forward. Marcus, sit down. I will not be... Marcus started. Sit. Down. The CEO's voice carried steel now. Marcus sat. His face had gone blotchy, red patches blooming across his neck. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the table. Diane continued as if the outburst hadn't happened. I've compiled a comprehensive review of your financial activities over the past 24 months. Vendor relationships, expense reports, conference attendance, client entertainment. She pulled out a bound report, easily 50 pages. The patterns are concerning. She slid the report across the table to Anderson. I'm recommending immediate suspension pending full audit. You can't do this, Marcus said. His voice had lost its command. Now he just sounded desperate. I've given 12 years to this company. My performance reviews are exemplary. You have no authority to— I have every authority. Diane's voice stayed quiet, lethal in its calm. But I'm not acting unilaterally. This is a board decision. She looked around the table. I'm calling for a vote on Marcus Webb's immediate termination as CFO, effective today, pending investigation into financial irregularities and potential fraud. Marcus shot to his feet again. This is because of what I said earlier. Because I didn't recognize you. His voice rose, cracking. You're offended, so you're manufacturing— No. Diane's single word silenced him. This is because you've been defrauding this company for 2 years. What you said earlier just revealed your character. The evidence reveals your crimes. She stood, matching his height with her presence, if not her physical stature. You saw a black woman and assumed she was beneath you. You made that assumption because you make assumptions every day, that you're smarter than oversight, that rules don't apply to you, that your position protects you from consequences. Her voice didn't rise, but power radiated from every word. You were wrong about me. You were wrong about everything. Marcus looked around the table wildly, searching for allies, for someone to speak up, to defend him, to call this the witch hunt he kept insisting it was. David Park studied his laptop. Sarah Chen met his eyes briefly, then looked away. The executives he'd mentored, promoted, protected, none of them moved. The silence was absolute. Someone, Marcus said. His voice cracked. Someone say something. This is insane. No one spoke. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Outside the glass walls, the city moved on, oblivious to the execution happening in this sterile room. Marcus's breathing came faster. His cologne, expensive, suffocating, seemed to intensify as sweat broke across his forehead. You people are really going to sit there? After everything I've done for this company? Jennifer, his assistant, cleared her throat softly from her corner position. Mr. Webb, I tried to warn you. Marcus spun toward her. What? Jennifer's voice was steady now, stronger than before. Before the meeting started, I tried to tell you Ms. Mitchell wasn't administrative staff. You told me I was interrupting something important. She pulled out her own folder. I also tried to tell you last month that your expense reports had discrepancies. You told me to mind my own business. And when I suggested you disclose the vendor relationships, you said I was overstepping. Jennifer walked to the table and placed her folder in front of Anderson. I've been documenting irregularities for 7 months. I didn't know what to do with the information. I was afraid I'd lose my job if I reported it. Marcus stared at her like she'd grown a second head. You're my assistant. You work for me. I work for the company, Jennifer corrected. Not for you. The distinction landed like a physical blow. Marcus actually stumbled back a step. Diane watched him process his complete isolation. Every assumption he'd built his career on was crumbling. The executives wouldn't defend him. His assistant had documented his crimes. The evidence was overwhelming, and the woman he'd dismissed as a secretary now held his entire future in her hands. I want a lawyer, Marcus said finally. I'm not saying anything else without legal counsel. That's your right, Anderson said, but the vote proceeds regardless. Marcus looked at Diane one last time. Something desperate flickered in his eyes, maybe understanding finally of exactly how wrong he'd been, about everything. You set me up, he whispered. Diane's expression didn't change. No, Mr. Webb, you did this to yourself. Today just made it visible. Diane returned to her seat at the table's head. She let the silence stretch, giving Marcus's isolation time to sink in for everyone watching. This wasn't just about him. It was about every executive in this room understanding that a new era had begun. Before we vote, she said, I want to acknowledge something. This company has operated under a culture that rewarded performance while ignoring character, that valued quarterly earnings over ethical leadership. She looked at each executive. That culture enabled what happened here. We're all complicit. Sarah Chen shifted uncomfortably. David Park nodded slowly. Change starts today, Diane continued. Not just with one termination, but with how we operate as an organization. Jennifer's courage in documenting problems despite fear of retaliation, that's the culture we need to build: transparency, accountability, protection. For people who speak truth to power. She turned to Jennifer. Effective immediately, I'm promoting you to interim CFO while we conduct a search for permanent replacement. You've demonstrated financial acumen, ethical judgment, and courage. Exactly what this position requires. Jennifer's eyes widened. Ms. Mitchell, I don't have the credentials for... You have an accounting degree from Northwestern, 7 years of financial operations experience, and most importantly, you have integrity. Diane smiled slightly. We'll provide executive training and support, but you've already proven yourself capable. Marcus made a sound, somewhere between laugh and sob. You're replacing me with my assistant. This is humiliation. This is consequence, Diane said. She pulled out another document, the one she'd been reviewing during Marcus's earlier presentation. While you were performing your budget restructuring, dismissing me as administrative staff, I was reviewing the very documents you'd left on the screen. She displayed the vendor contracts Marcus had shown earlier. You were sloppy, Mr. Webb, arrogant. You thought because I was taking notes in the corner I couldn't possibly understand complex financial structures. Her smile was cold. I have 2 decades of experience in corporate fraud investigation. Reading vendor contracts is literally my specialty. Robert Chen spoke for the first time since the meeting began. Ms. Mitchell consulted with the board specifically because we suspected irregularities but lacked concrete evidence. You provided that evidence yourself this morning. Marcus's face went gray. I provided... What are you talking about? Your restructuring proposal, Diane said. Eliminating compliance oversight. Consolidating vendor approval under your sole authority. Those recommendations revealed intent. They showed a pattern of removing safeguards against exactly what you've been doing. She picked up her notepad, the one Marcus had asked her to take minutes on. You also discussed house cleaning, removing dead weight. I noted every word, including your comment about diversity initiatives being a waste of resources on quotas instead of qualifications. Diane stood again. That comment wasn't illegal, but it revealed character. It showed how you view people like me, as less than, as beneath consideration, as administrative staff who should fetch your coffee. Her voice hardened. You've been stealing from this company for 2 years, but what you did this morning, dismissing me, ordering me to take notes, assuming my role based on my skin color, that revealed who you are. A man who believes the rules don't apply to him, who believes some people are inherently superior to others. She looked at Anderson. I'm ready to call the vote. Anderson stood at the table's head beside Diane. His expression was granite. We have a motion to terminate Marcus Webb as CFO, effective immediately, pending investigation into financial fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Discussion before we vote? Sarah Chen raised her hand. I'd like to say something. Her voice shook slightly, but she pressed on. Marcus approached me 3 weeks ago about supporting his bid for board chair. He suggested that my department was vulnerable to cuts unless I backed him. She looked at Diane. I said no. The next day, his restructuring proposal specifically targeted operations. David Park cleared his throat. He made similar implications to technology. Support him, or face budget scrutiny. One by one, executives spoke, not defending Marcus but confirming the pattern. The culture of intimidation, the quid pro quo arrangements, the quiet threats disguised as friendly advice. Marcus sat frozen, watching his empire collapse in real time. Anderson pulled out another folder. We've also received reports from HR, 3 formal complaints about hostile work environment and harassment, all involving women, all settled quietly with NDAs and financial payouts. He looked at Marcus with something like contempt. The company paid over $400,000 in settlements during your tenure. Money that came from operating budgets while you billed us for fake conferences. Diane added, the vendor fraud alone totals approximately $1.8 million over 24 months. Combined with fraudulent expense reports, we're looking at over $2 million in theft and embezzlement. Marcus's hands were shaking now. I want to speak, he said hoarsely. You have the floor, Anderson replied. Marcus stood unsteadily. He looked around the table, then at Diane. When he spoke, his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. I admit I made mistakes. The vendor relationships were poorly disclosed. Some expenses were exaggerated. He swallowed hard. But this isn't about fraud. This is about you, he pointed at Diane. His hand trembled. You orchestrated this entire thing. You came in here looking for a reason to take me down. You were offended that I didn't recognize you, so you manufactured evidence. I manufactured nothing, Diane said quietly. The evidence existed before I arrived. You created it over 2 years of systematic theft. But you humiliated me. Marcus's voice rose to a shout. You let me sit there and talk, knowing who you were, setting me up for what? Diane's voice cut through his outburst. For treating someone you perceived as inferior with contempt? For revealing your character? For proving that you see people like me as less than human? She leaned forward. I didn't set you up, Mr. Webb. I gave you rope. You hanged yourself. The room was silent except for Marcus's ragged breathing. Everything you did this morning, Diane continued, you've done your entire career. You saw someone you perceived as powerless, and you treated them accordingly. The only difference today is that person had power you didn't recognize. And now you're facing consequences you've avoided for years. She turned to the board. I call for a vote. All in favor of terminating Marcus Webb's employment as CFO, effective immediately. Hands rose around the table. Sarah Chen's first, then David Parks, Robert Chen's. One by one, every executive raised their hand. Even executives Marcus had considered allies. Even people he'd mentored. The vote was unanimous. Marcus stood there staring at the raised hands. No, he whispered. No, this isn't. You can't all... The motion passes, Anderson said. Marcus Webb, you are terminated as CFO effective immediately. You'll surrender your access credentials, company devices, and office keys to security. Legal will contact you regarding the investigation and potential criminal charges. Security appeared at the door. They'd been waiting, Diane realized. This outcome had been anticipated. Marcus looked at Diane one final time. His face was a ruin of shock and rage and something else. Maybe finally understanding. You destroyed me, he said. Diane met his eyes without flinching. No. You destroyed yourself the moment you saw my skin and decided I was beneath you. I just made sure everyone else saw it too. Security escorted Marcus Webb out of the boardroom. His footsteps echoed in the hall. Then silence. After Marcus left, no one spoke for a full minute. The boardroom felt different, lighter somehow, as if a toxic presence had been scrubbed from the air. Anderson was first to break the silence. That was the hardest termination I've overseen in 20 years. He looked at Diane with something like awe, and the most justified. Diane sat down slowly. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was draining away, leaving exhaustion in its wake. It shouldn't have taken this long. The warning signs were there for years. We ignored them, Sarah Chen said quietly, because he was profitable, because confronting him felt too risky. She looked at Diane. You didn't ignore them. I had the benefit of fresh eyes, Diane replied, and good instincts from people like Jennifer who documented everything. She turned to the interim CFO. You saved this company more than you know. Jennifer's eyes were wet. I was terrified. Every day I thought about quitting, just walking away and letting someone else deal with it. But you didn't, Diane said. That's courage. Not the absence of fear, but action despite it. Robert Chen spoke up. The board will need to issue a statement, explain the termination, and announce leadership changes. This will make news. Good, Diane said. Transparency, remember? We tell the truth. Executive misconduct was discovered and addressed swiftly. We don't minimize or hide. We own it and show how we're fixing it. Over the next hour, they rebuilt. Diane outlined her vision for cultural transformation: anonymous reporting systems, mandatory ethics training, diverse hiring practices, and transparent financial oversight. Each executive contributed ideas. The conversation that Marcus had tried to control earlier now flowed freely, collaboratively. As the meeting ended, Jennifer approached Diane. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. When he told you to take notes, you could have corrected him immediately, announced who you were. Why didn't you?" Diane considered the question. "Because I needed to see who he really was. Not the performance he gives when he knows he's being watched, but his authentic self. People reveal truth when they think there are no consequences." She gathered her materials. "Also, I wanted him to underestimate me." "Underestimation is a weapon when you know how to use it," Jennifer smiled. "My grandmother used to say something like that. She was a housekeeper." "Mine too," Diane said softly. They were smarter than anyone gave them credit for. As executives filed out, Sarah Chen stopped beside Diane. "Thank you." "For operations. For believing the restructuring was retaliation, not efficiency." "It was obvious once you knew what to look for," Diane replied. "He targeted you because you were the only other woman executive." "He saw you as competition," Sarah nodded. "Can I tell you something? When I first saw you sitting in the corner, I almost said something. Almost introduced you. But I hesitated because—" She trailed off. "Because you weren't sure," Diane finished. "In a company where Marcus Webb had power for 12 years, you'd learned not to challenge assumptions. Even your own. That changes now," Sarah said firmly. "Yes," Diane agreed. "It does." Later, alone in the boardroom, Diane called her daughter. "Hey, baby." "Mom, how was your first day as board chair?" Diane looked at the empty room. The chair Marcus had occupied, the corner where she'd been dismissed to, the table where justice had finally been served. "Productive," she said. "Very productive." Diane stood at the boardroom window as sunset painted the city in shades of amber and rose gold. 40 stories below, people rushed home from work, oblivious to the small revolution that had occurred in this glass tower. She thought about her grandmother, Betty Mitchell, who'd cleaned these buildings at night, who'd emptied trash cans containing documents people thought were invisible, who'd understood that powerful people perform their power constantly, and in that performance, they reveal everything. Today hadn't been about revenge. Revenge was emotional, reactive, hot. This had been about accountability, about creating a record, about showing that consequences exist even for people who've spent decades believing they were untouchable. Marcus Webb had looked at her and seen nothing but skin color and gender. He'd made assumptions based on prejudice so casual, he probably didn't even recognize it as prejudice. Just the natural order of things, just the way the world worked. And for him, for 12 years, the world had worked exactly that way. Diane's phone buzzed. A text from Robert Chen. "You did what needed doing. Get some rest. Tomorrow we start rebuilding." She smiled slightly. Tomorrow would bring press releases and damage control and the hard work of cultural transformation. But today they'd drawn a line. They'd said that performance doesn't excuse character. That profit doesn't justify fraud. That power doesn't protect you from truth. Diane picked up her briefcase, the one Robert had given her 15 years ago when she'd made VP. Worn leather, brass clasps that clicked satisfyingly. She'd carried this case through boardrooms across the country. Through presentations and negotiations and confrontations, today it had carried evidence that brought down a man who thought himself invincible. She looked at her reflection in the darkening window. The emerald green blazer she'd chosen this morning because it was Grandma Betty's favorite color. The woman staring back at her was tired but steady, Vindicated but not victorious, justice wasn't a trophy. It was a practice. As she walked toward the elevator, Diane thought about what Marcus had said. "You destroyed me." No, he'd destroyed himself years ago, one small compromise at a time. One buried complaint, one fraudulent expense report, one assumption that rules were for other people. She'd just made it visible. The elevator doors opened. Diane stepped inside, pressed the button for ground floor, and watched the boardroom disappear as she descended. Tomorrow, she'd begin the real work, building something better than what had existed before. But tonight, she'd call Kendra and tell her about the importance of documentation, courage, and never letting anyone make you smaller than you are. The building that Grandma Betty had cleaned was now commanded by her granddaughter, not through anger or revenge, but through competence, preparation, and the simple revolutionary act of refusing to accept disrespect. The table she'd been told to serve at, she'd taken her seat at its head and decided who could stay.